All right, so now today we're going to talk about factoring a trinomial where the value of a is not equal to 1. In the section 7.5, we factored where a is equal to 1, and we were able to just focus on the sign of the last term, but now a is not going to be equal to 1, so we have more to consider as far as our factors. And one of the first steps we need to remember is the importance of looking for a GCF out of all three terms to begin with. So that's our first example. Okay, so looking at the trinomial, we have 5x squared plus 15x plus 10. So we want to look for a greatest common factor. And we do see that the three terms, 5x squared, 15x, and 10, have a common factor of 5. So we're going to factor out that common factor, so undo the distributive, and we divide each of the three terms. We have 5 times the quantity x squared plus 3x plus 2, which leaves us with a trinomial. And our next step is to go ahead and factor that trinomial. So let's review those strategies before. What we know that we're going to have two binomials, so what you can do is think of x squared as x times x, and put the x here and the x here first, and then look at the sign of this third term. That gives me the clues. If the product is positive 2, then I want two numbers that multiply to give me 2, and we'll add. If this is positive, I'm going to look to add to get 3. So obviously 2 plus 1 is 3. And if this last sign is positive, that means both of these are the same sign, and they are the sign of the middle term. So this is our factored form. Okay, now we're going to take what we learned in first part of section 7.8 about factor by grouping and apply it to trinomials where a is not equal to 1. So we're going to go through this entire example. I have it all up here up front so you can kind of look at it first. We're going to use this X cross organizer to help us organize our information and then make it simpler. In the end, we'll be able to just do this. So first, we have the trinomial 3x squared plus 2x plus or minus 8. And where a is equal to 3, b is equal to 2, c is equal to 8. The first thing we want to consider is what is the product of a times c? So 3 times negative 8. A times c, 3 times negative 8 is negative 24. So in this top part of our cross, we're going to put the negative 24, the top little triangle. So negative 24 is the product of a times c. The value of b is 2, so we're going to put b in the bottom part of the cross, or the x. And then now we're going to consider, similar like we just did the previous example, we're going to think of this as being our product, and we want to combine that to get this middle term. So what two numbers will multiply to give us 24? And because that's negative, we want to think two numbers that multiply to give me 24, but subtract to give me 2. Well, that's 6 times 4. And we know that the signs of the two factors can't be the same because we need a positive times a negative. And because we want to be able to subtract and get a positive 2, the larger of those two factors will be positive. So we're going to use 6 times negative 4 because that gives me negative 24. So that's the product, the factor of AC, and the sum of those two factors is 2. So we're going to use 6 and negative 4. So now here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to take our original trinomial, and we want to use the factor by grouping method, which means we need 4 terms. So what we are doing is finding a way to split or rewrite this middle term as 2 terms, such as 6x minus 4x. If we combine that, we do get 2x. So we're just writing an equivalent expression that has 4 terms instead of 2 terms. So I have found that if I have this product of negative 24, the factors of 24 that subtract and give me 2 is 6 and negative 4. So we're going to use 6x and negative 4x as the split term. And then we'll follow our process we learned in the last section. We're going to group the first term, 2 terms, and we're going to group the second 2 terms. Then we're going to factor the GCF from each group. So we'll factor 3x from the first group and get x plus 2, 3x squared divided by 3x, and positive 6x divided by 3x is plus 2. Our second group, we're going to factor -4. This first term's a negative. So rather than just factor out 4, we always want to factor out a negative. So -4x divided by -4 is x. -8 divided by 4 is +2. And now we factor the common binomial. So we have x plus 2, and x plus 2 is the common binomial. And when we factor that, remove it from here, we're left with 3x. Remove it from here, and we're left with -4. Keep that sign. So our answer is 3x squared plus 2x minus 8. The factored form is x plus 2 times 3x minus 4. And to check it, you can use FOIL to make sure you get the same answer that the expression you started with. So now the next example we're going to walk through just a little bit slower and organize it just a little bit differently. So our next example, the first part, 4x squared plus 13x plus 3. So now this little chart kind of help us think about setting it up. We want to look for the factors, the product of A times C. So using our X cross method to organize, the product of A times C, 4 times 3 is 12. So we have AC is 12. Then look for the value of B, which is 13. So now we have 12 on the top and 13 on the bottom. So we're going to use our strategy here. I want factors of 12, and since that's positive, I want to add the two factors to get 13. So the factors of 12, 1 times 12 is 12. That will add to give me 13 is 1 plus 12. So 1 times 12 is 12, 1 plus 12 is 13. Now the other factors of 12 could have been 6 times 2 or 3 times 4, but the sum of 6 and 2 is not 13, and the sum of 3 and 4 is not 13. So this is our choice, 1 times 12. So now we're going to use that to set up our middle term split. We have 1, so that becomes 1x. 12 gives us the 12x, and that's going to be the two terms that we replace the middle term with. So now we're going to rewrite our trinomial in 4 terms. So we've got 13x replaced with 1 plus 12x. The next step is to group the first two terms and the second two terms to make our two groups. Then our next step is to factor the GCF from each group. So we factor we have a common factor of x, and that leaves 4x plus 1 when we divide it out. The next group has a common factor of 3. Divide 3 and you get 4x plus 1. And then our common binomial factor is 4x plus 1. We pull that from each term and we're left with x plus 3. Okay, next example. Part B of example 2 is 3x squared minus 7x plus 2. So let's just check, make sure that we don't have a GCF of any of the 3 terms, which we don't, and we didn't in the previous example either. We always should check that first. So same process. What's the product of A times C? And we're going to use our X cross method to organize our thinking. So A times C would be 3 times 2 is 6. So we're going to put 6 here. Then I want to find the value of B, which is -7, and I will put that here. And now we're going to use our process of taking the product AC. So look here, this is our clues. What two numbers multiply to give you 6? And since it's positive, you think two numbers that multiply and add to give you 7. Well, they're going to actually give me a -7. So that means if this is positive and this is negative, then the two numbers I combine together must both be negative. So I can still just think about the factors of 6 give me 7, which would be 1 times 7. 1 times 6 is 6, and 1 plus 6 is 7. But we need to have the two factors both be negative, so a negative times negative is positive. And then we combine a -6 plus a -1, we get -7. So I'm going to use -6x and -1x as my two new middle term split expressions. And then we're going to take our original trinomial and rewrite it, replacing -7x with our -6x minus 1x. And then next step, once we've got our 4 terms, we're going to group the first 2 terms and the second 2 terms. And our next step is GCF from each group. So the GCF here is 3x. That leaves x minus 2. The GCF here is going to be a -1. We want to factor out a negative. Always factor out a negative. So divide by -1, and we get positive x, and then positive divided by negative gives us -2. Now we can see our common binomial factors is x minus 2. Pull those out, and that leaves you with 3x minus 1. Keep the same sign. Okay, next example. We do not have a GCF, so we're going to consider the same process again. Now you can pause the video at any time or back it up just so you can write these down. The product of A times C. Here's our X cross organizer. A times C. 2 times -7 is -14. The value of B is -5. So we'll put -5 into our organizer. Now let's go back here and use our clues. I want 2 factors of 14, but now since this is negative, my thinking goes with 2 numbers that multiply to give me 14. So it must be a positive times a negative to get a negative. And those 2 numbers, when I subtract them, I need to get a -5. So first of all, just think about 2 numbers that multiply to give you 14. And if you subtract the numbers, you get 5. Well, that's 7 times 2. But if this is negative, one of them is factors is positive, the other factor is negative. So let's consider 2 times -7, which gives me -14, and then verify that 2 plus -7 is -5. So that tells me that the 2 will be the positive factor and -7 is the negative factor. And that's because we want to end up with a -5. If this value here had been +5, then these signs would be switched. But now we know our 2 factors to create our middle term split. So we're going to use positive 2x and -7x. And that gives us our split terms. And now we're going to rewrite our trinomial with 4 terms, replacing -5x with 2x minus 7x. And now hopefully you know the next step is to do the 2 groups. First 2, second 2. Find the GCF of each group. So the GCF of the first group is 2x. Divide out 2x, and you get x plus 1. The GCF of the second group would be a -7, and we're dividing out that negative because we always want to divide out a negative and make sure that this inside first term is positive. So this gives us positive x plus 1, and our common binomial is x plus 1, so that leaves 2x minus 7. Okay, next example. Last one, actually. We don't have a common factor, but the first term is -1. So when we have a first term of -1, when a is negative, we want to factor the -1 from each term so that the resulting factor, and then we're going to factor the resulting trinomial like we did the previous one. So the first step here is just to factor out this -1, the one's not written. But basically, when you divide each term by -1, it changes the signs. So we have a -1 times the quantity, 4x squared plus 8x minus 5. And then we're going to go through our process, and we notice that since c is -5, we're going to have a similar situation as the last example. Okay, so let's set up our organizer. A times C, so now we're going to do A, for just using the inside trinomial. 4 times -5 is -20. B is 8. And then we need to think of our clues. I want a product. I have a product of -20. So what 2 factors of 20, and since this is negative, 2 numbers, you multiply to get 20, subtract to give you 8, a positive 8. Well, the 2 factors have to be opposite in sign because you're subtracting. But 2 times 10 is 20, and if you take 10 minus 2, you get 8, and 8 is positive, so that means I'm going to use -2 and positive 10. So when I combine them, that gives me a positive 8x like I had in the middle term. So now that we have this organized, we're going to use the split middle terms and rewrite our trinomial. So we keep the negative factored out front, -1. I wrote -1 so we remember where that came from. And then we have 8x is going to be split or rewritten as 10x minus 2x. And notice I wrote it over here. I had 2x and 10x. And so what I need to do here is actually I 2 and 5 don't have a common factor. So when I think about rewriting it, I'm going to switch these two middle terms back so that I can have groups that have common factors. So now the inside four terms will be regrouped. So now I have the brackets because I have -1 and then a bracket because I'm working with the inside. So I make two groups inside. And then we're going to look at the two groups inside and find the GCF of the two groups. So the first group has a GCF of 2x, which gives us 2x minus 1 when we divide it from both terms. Our second group has a GCF of 5. That's why I wanted to rearrange it here. And then divide 5 from each term, we get 2x minus 1. 1 should be there. And then we're going to look at our common binomial factors as 2x minus 1. And that pulls out 2x plus 5, and we have the -1 in front. And then just to simplify the way we write it, we don't need the brackets anymore. We just simply have three factors: -1 times 2x minus 1 times the quantity 2x plus 5. Okay, your assignment is a worksheet to be completed and submitted in Google Classroom.